My boss fired me for not performing despite bringing in 60% of the company's revenue. It's a law firm, and I am part of the senior partners. He said, we need hungrier talents who can meet higher targets. I smiled and thanked him for the opportunity. The next day, I woke up to 56 missed calls from him. But that was just the beginning. Hello. Thank you for your continuous support. This means a lot to us. If you enjoy the stories we share, kindly subscribe to this channel. It would be great if you can also comment on which city you are watching from. We might just give you a shout out in our next story. Today, our special shout out goes to Pamela Hill from Atlanta. We are glad you enjoy our stories. Now let's dive into the details of today's story. It was a Tuesday morning when I walked into Arthur Garrison's office, expecting another routine meeting to discuss upcoming cases and the firm's growth. I had been with Garrison and Klein for over a decade, and my place in the company felt secure. But when I sat across from Arthur that morning, I could tell something was off. The air in his office was heavier than usual, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Little did I know, this meeting would mark the end of my time at the firm and the beginning of my own journey. James, Arthur started, his voice low and deliberate. I've been thinking about where we're headed, and I think we need to make some changes. His words were a slow burn, each one landing with the force of a hammer. You've been great, but frankly, we need hungrier talents who can meet higher targets. The industry is evolving, and I don't think you're the right fit anymore. His words landed like a punch to the gut. I was stunned, unsure whether I had heard him correctly. I had brought in 60% of the firm's revenue over the years. I had dedicated long hours, secured high-profile clients, and worked my tail off to make this firm what it was. And now, Arthur was telling me that my best wasn't enough. The man I had respected, the man who had trusted me with some of the firm's most critical cases, was suddenly turning his back on me. Hungrier talents. Was that what I had become? Was I just another number? A cog in the wheel? Easily replaced? I forced a smile, even though I felt betrayed. I understand, Arthur, I replied, keeping my voice even. Thank you for the opportunity. It wasn't the answer I wanted to give, but I knew there was nothing else to say. He wasn't going to change his mind. He never did. Arthur's face softened for a brief moment, almost like he felt guilty for the decision he had made. But it was too late for that. There was no coming back from this. I hope you understand, James, he continued. This isn't personal. We just need to pivot in a new direction. His words were hollow. A convenient excuse for betraying the person who had helped make this firm what it was. I stood up from my chair, the air in the room thick with unspoken tension. I gave Arthur a curt nod and turned to leave. As I walked out, I couldn't help but feel a rush of anger building in my chest. I had been loyal to this firm for years. My clients had been loyal to me. And now, just like that, I was nothing more than a liability. The thought gnawed at me, but I pushed it down. I wouldn't let this be the end. It couldn't be. Back at my desk, I sat in silence for a few minutes, staring out of the window at the city skyline. I thought about the countless hours I had spent working for this firm, the blood, sweat, and tears I had poured into cases that brought in millions for the company. It wasn't just a job, it was my career, my legacy. And now, Arthur was throwing it all away. But I wasn't going to let him win. I wasn't going to be cast aside like some insignificant cog in the machine. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. It's time, I said when the voice on the other end answered. The plan had been set in motion, and there was no turning back now. I wasn't going to beg for my place at Garrison and Klein. I was going to build something better, something all my own. I was going to take everything I had learned and turn it into a new beginning. The foundation for Monroe and Associates was being laid that very moment. An hour later, I had contacted my lawyer, my accountant, and a few former colleagues I trusted. It was happening. Monroe and Associates would rise from the ashes of my betrayal. I was going to make Arthur regret this decision. I wasn't just going to leave quietly. I would build something that would eclipse everything he had worked so hard to build. He wouldn't see it coming. I registered the firm that afternoon. It was a clean slate, a fresh start. I spent the rest of the day writing an email to my network of clients, explaining my decision to leave the firm and how Monroe and Associates would provide the same high-caliber service they had come to expect, only better. My phone rang as I was finishing the email. I glanced at the screen. Arthur. I smiled grimly and hit decline. The message was clear. He had lost me. The sting of Arthur's words lingered, but I had no time to dwell on them. As soon as I left the office that afternoon, I felt a strange calmness wash over me. The anger, the betrayal, it had all been replaced by something far more powerful: determination. I wasn't just going to survive this. I was going to thrive. Monroe and Associates wasn't just a new firm. It was my chance to show Arthur, the other partners, and the entire legal world that I was more than just a cog in their machine. I was going to build my own empire, one that would eclipse the very firm that had dismissed me. I went home that evening and sat at my desk, my thoughts racing. My head buzzed with possibilities, each one more thrilling than the last. I thought about all the things I could do differently, the mistakes I had seen at Garrison and Klein that I would never make in my own firm. Monroe and Associates would not be bogged down by the same bureaucratic nonsense that had kept me from reaching my full potential. I would run my firm the way it should have been run from the start: client-centered, agile, and hungry. The word Arthur had used to dismiss me was going to be the very thing that propelled me forward. I opened my laptop and started drafting an email to my most trusted clients. Some were old friends. Others were high-profile figures who had come to depend on me over the years. I knew exactly what I had to say. I wasn't going to beg for their business, but I was going to invite them to join me on this new journey. After all, I wasn't just offering them legal services. I was offering them something better: a firm with personalized service, a team of experienced attorneys who knew how to get things done, and a leadership that would always have their back. I was no longer just an associate at a firm. I was now the face of Monroe and Associates. The next few days were a whirlwind. I met with former colleagues who had worked with me at Garrison and Klein. Many of them were already disillusioned with the direction the firm was taking under Arthur's leadership. They had seen the signs, the micromanagement, the shift in priorities, the way Arthur started focusing on the bottom line instead of the clients. I knew they would jump at the chance to join me. Within a week, I had secured a solid team of attorneys, all of whom were ready to bring their talents to my new firm. But building the firm wasn't just about assembling a team of legal experts. It was about positioning Monroe and Associates as a force to be reckoned with. I pored over marketing strategies, reaching out to trusted advisors who could help me build the firm's brand from the ground up. The more I immersed myself in the details, the clearer my vision became. Monroe and Associates wasn't just another law firm. It was going to be a destination for clients who demanded the best, and for lawyers who wanted to work under a leader who valued their expertise. Meanwhile, back at Garrison and Klein, I kept an ear to the ground. I heard whispers of discontent. Arthur was struggling. Clients were starting to question the firm's direction, and there was talk of more layoffs. It wasn't long before I received my first call. It was a former client, someone I had worked with on several complex cases, now reaching out to ask if I was available for a new project. I smiled as I picked up the phone, my heart racing with the knowledge that Monroe and Associates was already becoming a reality, one client at a time. As the weeks passed, the pieces of my new life began to fall into place. I secured office space in a sleek downtown building, one that would give Monroe and Associates the professional image it needed. I hired an administrative team to handle the day-to-day operations. I made sure every detail was in place, no stone left unturned. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about creating something lasting. I was building my legacy, not out of bitterness, but out of the pure, unadulterated desire to succeed. And just as I was starting to feel like I was finally in control, Arthur called again. This time, I didn't hit decline. Instead, I picked up the phone and listened to his voice, now laced with desperation. "James," he said, his tone softer than before, "we've made a mistake. You're irreplaceable. We need you back." I didn't answer him immediately. I let the silence hang in the air, savoring the moment. This was my victory, and I had earned every bit of it. Arthur had no idea what he was dealing with. His firm was falling apart, and mine was just getting started. I wasn't going back to the place that had cast me aside. Monroe and Associates was my future, and I was in control now. "Arthur," I said finally, my voice calm but firm, "I've moved on. I'm not coming back." And with that, I ended the call. The first few days after I launched Monroe and Associates were a blur of excitement and intense focus. I was putting every ounce of energy into making my firm a success, and so far, the results were promising. I had already started securing some of my former clients, and the word was beginning to spread that Monroe and Associates was quickly becoming a serious contender in the legal field. But just as I was starting to get comfortable, I felt a cold, familiar buzz in my pocket. It was Arthur. I stared at the screen for a moment, a dark satisfaction rising within me. It had been a few days since I had launched the firm, and I knew Arthur had been getting the message. But this call was different. His desperate tone was clear, even through the brief voicemail he left. "James, I know you're upset, but please, we've made a mistake. You're irreplaceable. We need you back." He sounded like a man on the verge of a breakdown, and it was almost satisfying to hear. But I didn't answer. Not yet. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of thinking he could just snap his fingers and bring me back into the fold. No, he had underestimated me. I was no longer bound by the constraints of Garrison and Klein. I was now in a position where I made the rules. Over the next few days, the calls came more frequently. Each voicemail was more urgent, more desperate than the last. "James, please," one of them began. "We need your expertise. You're the reason our clients trusted us, and now they're all leaving." I could almost hear the panic in Arthur's voice as he spoke. It was strange. This man who had once been my mentor, my boss, was now begging for my help. It wasn't enough that I had given him a decade of my life. Now, I was supposed to come back and fix what he had broken. I couldn't help but feel a rush of power. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I had spent years working tirelessly to build a client base, a reputation, and a name for myself. And now, I was the one calling the shots. But I also knew that Arthur wasn't going to give up easily. The next day, my phone rang again. I didn't need to look at the caller ID to know it was him. I had already received 3 more voicemails in the span of just a few hours, each one more pleading than the last. But this time, I answered. "James," Arthur's voice crackled through the phone, sounding even more defeated than before. "I'm sorry. I was wrong to let you go. Please, I'm begging you. Come back. We'll make it right. I can't do this without you." I felt the weight of his words, the desperation in his tone, but I didn't let it sway me. This was my moment, and I had worked too hard to get here. I had moved on, and there was no going back. "Arthur," I said, my voice steady, "you had your chance. I've already moved on. Monroe and Associates is my future now, and I'm not coming back." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, as if he was still processing my words. Then, he said, "James, you're making a huge mistake. Think about everything we've built together. The clients, the cases, we're not the same without you." His words hung in the air for a moment, but I didn't let them affect me. I wasn't going to fall for his manipulation. I had seen the way he operated. He wanted to keep me as his safety net. He wanted to continue using my skills and connections to prop up a firm that had long since lost its way. But I wasn't his crutch anymore. "I've thought about it, Arthur," I replied, my voice unwavering. "And I'm not coming back. You had your shot. It's over." I could almost hear the defeat in his sigh as the call ended. He tried to salvage some dignity, but it was clear he knew he had lost me for good. And as I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. The man who had once held my future in his hands was now just another casualty in my rise to power. But as the days passed, it became clear that Arthur's desperation wasn't over. His firm was beginning to unravel, clients were leaving in droves, and rumors of layoffs started circulating. I heard whispers about how Garrison and Klein's reputation was taking a hit, how their once stellar leadership was now in question. Monroe and Associates was thriving, while Garrison and Klein was in freefall. Arthur kept calling, but I didn't pick up again. He had made his move, and so had I. There was no going back, and there was no way I was going to let him think he could just drag me back into the fold. It was time for him to face the consequences of his own actions. I had made my decision, and it was one I wasn't going to regret. As the days turned into weeks, Monroe and Associates began to gain momentum. What started as a seed of an idea, planted by anger and the desire for redemption, was now a fully fledged operation, and it was thriving in ways I hadn't expected. The office was bustling, the clients were satisfied, and most importantly, the legal community was starting to take notice. But as the firm grew, so did the realization that Garrison and Klein wasn't just going to fade quietly into the background. Arthur was still scrambling to recover, and I knew that would only make things more interesting. I hadn't intended to steal clients from my former firm, not at first. But as the phone calls from old clients came in, the strategy became clear. I didn't have to steal anyone. I simply had to offer them a better alternative. And that's exactly what I did. My firm was agile. We offered better terms, more personalized service, and a focus on results, not just billable hours. But more than that, we offered trust. It had been the one thing Garrison and Klein lacked. Arthur's heavy-handed leadership and obsession with expansion had left the clients feeling neglected, like cogs in the machine. At Monroe and Associates, every client was treated like they mattered, because they did. Word spread quickly. Lawyers I had worked with in the past reached out, asking if there were any positions available at the new firm. I knew that, in their minds, it was an opportunity to join a firm that was on the rise, one where their hard work would be valued, not just the bottom line. I welcomed them with open arms. Slowly, but surely, I began to assemble a team of talented attorneys who weren't just looking for a paycheck. They were looking for a place where they could truly make an impact. I wasn't just building a firm. I was creating a movement. I'll admit, it felt good to see the familiar faces of my old colleagues walking through the door. But it felt even better knowing that I was creating something that would eventually outshine everything Garrison and Klein had built. Arthur had always prided himself on his firm's legacy, but that legacy was built on my blood, sweat, and tears. Without me, it would crumble. It wasn't long before I started hearing whispers. Clients were calling in, seeking our expertise on cases Garrison and Klein had once handled. They were no longer satisfied with Arthur's way of doing business. They wanted results, and they wanted someone who could give them trust again. With each new client, Monroe and Associates grew more powerful. And each time I saw Arthur's firm flounder, I felt a satisfaction I couldn't explain. I knew Arthur wasn't just going to let me take what I wanted without putting up a fight. He was starting to feel the pressure. And so, in a way, I could almost feel the tension building. Arthur had done his best to keep his head above water, trying to save face by calling in outside help. But all he was doing was prolonging the inevitable. Monroe and Associates was more than just a firm, it was a force. It was the future, and Garrison and Klein's time had passed. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for, the first big legal challenge. It was a high-profile case, one that Garrison and Klein had been handling for years, but their lead counsel, an old friend of mine, was now working for me. The case had significant stakes, and Arthur saw it as his firm's chance to turn things around. But there was a problem. The clients weren't happy with the way Garrison and Klein was handling things. They had grown tired of the delays, the lack of communication, and the impersonal service. And so, they came to me. At first, it was a simple consultation. I met with the clients, explained my approach, and reassured them that they were in good hands. They saw the difference immediately. Where Garrison and Klein had been slow to act, we moved swiftly. Where Arthur's team had been bogged down by corporate red tape, I offered direct, personal attention. We were lean, we were focused, and we had the hunger to win. The decision to hire us wasn't just about the outcome of the case. It was about trust. They had lost faith in Arthur and Garrison and Klein, and they knew we would deliver where others had failed. It was a major victory for Monroe and Associates and a devastating blow to Arthur's firm. The moment the contract was signed, I felt a surge of pride. But more than that, I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. Arthur was about to realize that his clients weren't loyal to him. They were loyal to me. And I was just getting started. I didn't waste any time in capitalizing on the success. As word spread, we began receiving more high-profile cases, more clients eager to make the switch. It became clear that Monroe and Associates wasn't just an alternative. It was the option for anyone who wanted results. And as we continued to build momentum, I couldn't help but smile at the thought of how far we had come in such a short time. Back at Garrison and Klein, I could sense the panic building. Arthur was scrambling. Clients were leaving and staff were beginning to jump ship. I heard rumors that the firm was considering a major restructuring to try to stabilize, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Monroe and Associates was now the firm to beat, and there was nothing Arthur could do to stop it. As I sat in my office one evening, watching the city lights twinkle outside my window, I knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. I wasn't just going to take over Garrison and Klein. I was going to change the game entirely. It was inevitable. When you start to hit someone where it hurts, reputation, clients, revenue, they're going to fight back. And Arthur wasn't the kind of man to let his empire crumble without putting up a fight. So it wasn't a surprise when I received the first legal notice. The document was clear and straightforward. Garrison and Klein was suing Monroe and Associates for breach of contract and unfair competition. I had expected this. The battle for power was just beginning, and Arthur wasn't going to go down without trying to take me with him. As soon as I opened the letter, I felt a rush of adrenaline. The firm had filed suit, claiming that I had violated the terms of my non-compete agreement, specifically the clause about not soliciting former clients. Arthur was accusing me of poaching his clients, of undermining the very foundation of his business. It wasn't just a legal battle, it was a personal attack. But what Arthur didn't realize was that this was exactly the kind of fight I was prepared for. I had spent years working with some of the top legal minds in the industry. I had absorbed knowledge, not just about the law, but about how to navigate these very situations. I knew this case wouldn't be easy, but I also knew Arthur was bluffing. His non-compete agreement had loopholes. It was broad, vague, and unenforceable in many ways, but I couldn't just count on that. I needed to play this carefully. I needed to make sure I didn't just win this battle, but destroyed his ability to come back. I called in my top attorneys, men and women I trusted, who had followed me from Garrison and Klein. We met in the conference room at Monroe and Associates, surrounded by stacks of documents and legal briefings. The atmosphere was tense, but I could see the determination in their eyes. They knew what was at stake. Arthur wasn't just fighting me, he was fighting the future, and the future was already in my hands. We've got the upper hand here, I told them, my voice steady and confident. Arthur is going to fight, but he's fighting against a wall. We need to make sure we hit him hard with every detail, every clause. We're going to show that his firm is the one that's been violating the trust of clients, not mine. We dove into the details of the case. Arthur's legal team was throwing everything they could at us. Accusations of unfair competition, claims that I had used confidential client information, even suggesting that I had orchestrated a campaign of corporate espionage. But the more we dug into their allegations, the more we realized how weak their case was. They had no evidence that I had violated confidentiality agreements, no proof that I had poached clients using illegal methods. They were simply upset that I had managed to take what they considered theirs. As we prepared for court, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction. The lawsuits, the accusations, it was all just noise. Arthur was trying to distract from the truth. He had failed as a leader. His firm was dying because he wasn't the leader he used to be. I wasn't just fighting him in a courtroom. I was fighting him for respect. He had underestimated me, thinking I was just another associate who would fade into obscurity when he dismissed me. Now, I was the one who was in control. The case made headlines. Legal blogs covered every twist and turn of the battle. The media was full of speculation. Would Monroe and Associates be able to survive the legal onslaught? Or would Arthur and Garrison and Klein come out on top? I had a feeling they underestimated the power of a public relations war. I started feeding the media carefully curated updates, portraying myself as a victim of corporate greed. Arthur's actions started to look less like business and more like an act of desperation, and the public took notice. Clients who had once been loyal to Garrison and Klein started questioning their allegiance. They didn't just want a lawyer, they wanted someone who could be trusted. As the case drew closer to trial, Arthur began to buckle under the pressure. He wasn't used to this kind of fight. He was used to sitting behind a desk and making decisions. Now, the fight was happening in the courtroom, where everything he had built was being torn apart by the very man he had dismissed. Monroe and Associates wasn't just fighting for survival, it was fighting for dominance. And I wasn't going to let Arthur win. The day the trial started, I walked into the courtroom with a sense of calm confidence. The opposing counsel tried to rattle me, but I didn't flinch. Arthur was the one on the defensive now. His case was built on weak assumptions, and he had no real legal standing. The law was on my side. I was about to turn the tables, and there was nothing he could do about it. The courtroom was packed with attorneys, journalists, and legal experts, all watching the battle unfold. I could feel the tension in the air, but I didn't let it shake me. I had made my move, and now I was going to watch as Garrison and Klein's empire crumbled. Arthur was sweating now. I could see it on his face. His once imposing stature had been reduced to a man scrambling to save face. But it was too late. His firm was unraveling, and no lawsuit could change that. This was more than just a legal battle. This was the end of his story and the start of mine. The moment the lawsuit became public, I knew the stakes had just skyrocketed. Garrison and Klein wasn't just fighting for its own survival anymore. It was fighting for its reputation. And that, in many ways, was far more valuable than money. Arthur was used to being the respected leader of a prestigious law firm. Now, he was being painted as a corporate villain, a man who had driven his own star partner out of the firm, only to watch everything collapse in his wake. It didn't take long before the legal blogs, newspapers, and even TV networks picked up the story. The battle between Monroe and Associates and Garrison and Klein was everywhere. Headlines screamed about betrayal, corporate greed, and a high-stakes war for control of the New York legal scene. But what caught my attention wasn't just the media coverage. It was the reaction from our clients. People were talking. They were looking at Arthur's firm and asking themselves if they really wanted to stay with someone who was now embroiled in scandal and legal battles. And the answer was clear: no. I didn't let up on the media blitz. Each time Arthur's legal team tried to push a new narrative, I countered with a more compelling one. I began holding interviews with trusted outlets, discussing the importance of trust in the legal industry. I emphasized that Monroe and Associates wasn't just a law firm. It was a place where clients came first. The public ate it up. I played the victim, portraying myself as someone who had been cast aside by a man who no longer understood the value of loyalty or integrity. The media couldn't resist covering the underdog story, and Arthur's firm was slowly being depicted as the corporate bully, clinging to a past it no longer deserved. But the most powerful tool in this public battle wasn't the headlines. It was the voices of the clients and former employees who came forward to speak out. One by one, clients I had worked with at Garrison and Klein reached out, not just to hire me, but to publicly denounce Arthur's firm. They were tired of being treated as just numbers, of being caught in the middle of a corporate power struggle. They wanted someone who would listen to their needs and fight for them, not someone who would play games with their livelihoods. I knew this was a turning point. The media had already decided who the hero was, and it wasn't Arthur. The court of public opinion had shifted, and there was no turning back. Monroe and Associates was the new face of legal excellence, and Garrison and Klein was a sinking ship. But even as the media spotlight shone brightly on me, I knew Arthur wasn't finished yet. He still had a few tricks up his sleeve, and I expected him to fight tooth and nail to salvage whatever was left of his legacy. But now, he was on the defensive. Every move he made was being scrutinized. And I had learned long ago that the moment you're in the public eye, your weaknesses become glaringly obvious. I watched as Garrison and Klein began losing clients left and right. Major corporations, once loyal to the firm, pulled their cases and sought new counsel. The phone calls came in quickly, prospective clients, former clients, even competing firms reaching out to see how they could work with us. I had a pipeline of cases that would secure Monroe and Associates as the go-to legal powerhouse in New York, and it was all happening because of Arthur's mistake. One day, I received a call from a client I hadn't expected to hear from. A prominent tech company that had been with Garrison and Klein for years. The CEO, a man I had worked with before, wanted to meet in person. When I sat down with him, I could tell that the tides had turned. He wasted no time in laying out the offer. "James," he said, looking me squarely in the eye, "we're pulling all our business from Garrison and Klein. You've always been the one we trusted, not Arthur. We'd like to move our accounts to Monroe and Associates starting immediately." I smiled. This wasn't just a win, it was the win. I had claimed the crown that Arthur had so carelessly taken for granted. But I wasn't done. I knew that Garrison and Klein's fall wasn't just about clients. It was about Arthur himself. If he wanted to salvage his reputation, he would have to do more than just cry foul in the courts. He would have to confront me directly, and I was ready for that day to come. The pressure on Arthur was mounting. His firm was failing, and he was starting to feel the heat. The media were painting him as a villain, and the more desperate he became, the more the cracks in his leadership became visible. Every move he made seemed to backfire, and every time he tried to cover his tracks, I was there, making sure the public saw the truth. And then, it happened. Arthur called again. This time, I didn't hit decline. This time, I answered. "James," he said, his voice breaking, "please, I need you. We're losing everything. You don't understand. We can't survive this without you." I listened, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction wash over me. I had finally broken him. But instead of gloating, I kept my voice calm, steady. "You had your chance, Arthur," I said, my words deliberate. "You chose to let me go. And now, you'll have to live with the consequences." The line went silent for a long moment before he spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "I was wrong." "Yes, you were," I replied, and with that, I ended the call. The trial had been dragging on for weeks, each day a new volley of accusations from Arthur's team, each new attempt to discredit Monroe and Associates only pushing us further into the limelight. But despite all the bluster and all the noise, I could feel the momentum shifting in my favor. The media, the clients, even the employees of Garrison and Klein, everyone was starting to realize what I already knew. Arthur's time had passed. He was scrambling, floundering, trying desperately to hold on to something that had long since slipped from his grasp. I had seen this coming. I had prepared for it. But still, as I watched his legal team struggle in the courtroom, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. He was on the ropes. Arthur had underestimated me at every turn, thinking I was just a senior partner who could be easily replaced. But here I was, with Monroe and Associates growing stronger by the day, while his empire slowly crumbled. It was during one of the most critical hearings that things took a turn. The judge had already expressed his frustration with the frivolous nature of some of the claims Arthur's team had filed. It became clear that they were grasping at straws, throwing anything they could at us, hoping something would stick. But it wasn't just the judge who was starting to notice, it was the jury, too. They were seeing the cracks in Arthur's case, and more importantly, they were seeing the truth. Arthur had no solid ground to stand on. That's when my legal team hit them with a bombshell. We had spent the last few days combing through the documents, digging through emails, memos, and meetings that Arthur's team had thought were private. We uncovered something that had been buried for years, a pattern of unethical practices within Garrison and Klein that, if proven in court, would destroy Arthur's reputation and the firm's credibility. It was a game changer. The revelation came out of nowhere. I had known for some time that Arthur's firm had been operating in the gray areas, cutting corners where they could to increase profits. But I hadn't anticipated the depth of the misconduct. We presented the evidence, each piece meticulously gathered, each document carefully prepared. The courtroom went silent as the jury absorbed what they had just seen. Arthur's team was visibly shaken, scrambling to refute what was right in front of them. But there was no denying it. The truth was out. Arthur was no longer just the head of a failing firm. He was now a man whose leadership had enabled widespread malpractice. The press seized on the story immediately, with headlines screaming about corporate corruption, deceit, and the fall of a once proud law firm. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a public spectacle, and the public had turned on Arthur. As the weeks passed, Garrison and Klein continued to hemorrhage clients. But it wasn't just the clients they were losing. The firm's reputation was beyond repair. Arthur tried to salvage what he could, reaching out to former partners and clients, pleading for their return. But it was too late. No one trusted him anymore. I knew this was the turning point. I had Monroe and Associates firmly established in the legal world now. The case against Garrison and Klein had begun to feel like a formality. But there was still one more act to play out, the final confrontation. Arthur wasn't going to let me walk away from this without a fight. I could feel it in the air. He wasn't finished yet, but I was ready. I had outsmarted him, outlasted him, and outclassed him at every turn. He had made the mistake of underestimating me. And now, I was going to finish what I had started. The night before the final trial session, I sat in my office, reflecting on how far I had come. The battle had been long, exhausting, and at times, overwhelming. But I had learned from every setback, every obstacle. I had turned every betrayal into fuel for my success. And tomorrow would be the final act. Arthur's defeat was inevitable, but I wanted to see it in black and white. I wanted him to understand that his decisions had led to this moment. I wasn't the same man who had walked into Arthur's office that day. I wasn't the man who had been dismissed so callously. I was someone else now, someone who had taken control of his own destiny, built his own legacy, and wasn't afraid to fight for it. As I prepared for the final day of the trial, I felt an overwhelming sense of closure. It had taken months of hard work, of strategizing and executing every move with precision. But this was it, the moment when everything I had built would be proven to be not just valid, but necessary. I was about to turn the page on the chapter of my life that had once been dominated by Arthur's decisions. The next day would be the end of his story, and the beginning of mine. The final day of the trial arrived, and the weight of it all hung heavy in the air. I had spent months preparing for this day, ensuring that every detail was covered, every angle considered. The battle between Monroe and Associates and Garrison and Klein had reached its climax, and today, the truth would finally come to light. As I walked into the courtroom, I could feel the eyes of the public, the media, and the jury upon me. But I wasn't nervous. In fact, I felt more confident than I had ever felt in my life. This was my moment. Arthur sat across from me, his once imposing presence now diminished. He had become a man on the brink of ruin, trying desperately to maintain what little dignity he had left. His once pristine suit looked worn, his face pale, and his hands trembled ever so slightly as he shuffled through his papers. He knew it was over. He knew that no matter how hard he fought, he had lost. The judge entered the courtroom, and the proceedings began. Arthur's legal team made one last-ditch effort to salvage their case, but I could see the cracks forming in their arguments. Every time they spoke, they dug themselves deeper into a hole. Their accusations of unfair competition, of corporate espionage, of poaching clients, all of it had been discredited. They had no evidence to support their claims, and the jury was starting to see it. But the real blow came when we presented the final piece of evidence. I had kept this piece of information under wraps for as long as possible, knowing that it would be the decisive factor. Arthur's malpractice, the unethical business practices that had been happening under his watch, was the final nail in the coffin. We presented a series of emails, internal memos, and documents that showed a clear pattern of misconduct. Arthur's firm had been cutting corners, mishandling clients, and even engaging in questionable billing practices. It was the kind of thing no one would have expected from a firm with such a prestigious reputation, but here it was, right in front of everyone. The courtroom fell silent. I could feel the tension, the weight of the evidence, the shift in the air as everyone processed what they had just heard. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. This was the fall of an empire. Arthur's empire. Arthur's face drained of color as he realized what was happening. He looked at his legal team, his eyes wide with disbelief. But there was no escaping it now. The truth had been laid bare for everyone to see. His reputation was shattered. Garrison and Klein was finished. The judge, having heard the evidence and seen the overwhelming support for our claims, called for a short recess before delivering his verdict. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. I could feel the eyes of the jury on me, but I didn't flinch. I had already won. The case was over, and all that was left was for the judge to make it official. When the recess was over, the judge returned to his seat. He glanced down at the papers in front of him before looking up at Arthur. The words that followed were the ones I had been waiting for, the words that sealed Arthur's fate. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, and in light of the unethical practices demonstrated by Garrison and Klein, I find in favor of Monroe and Associates. I also rule that Garrison and Klein shall pay for the legal fees incurred by both parties. The case is dismissed, and I encourage the parties to settle any remaining disputes outside the courtroom. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The battle was over. Arthur had lost. Garrison and Klein had lost. And I had won, not just in court, but in every sense of the word. This victory wasn't just about the case. It was about proving to everyone, including myself, that I was more than capable of building something on my own. I wasn't just a senior partner. I wasn't just the guy who brought in the clients. I was the man who built Monroe and Associates, and now I was the one in control. Arthur didn't say a word as the verdict was read. His shoulders slumped, and his gaze fell to the floor. The once mighty leader of Garrison and Klein was now a man defeated, not just by the court, but by his own arrogance. I watched him for a moment, the weight of his failures settling around him like a cloak. It was over. As the courtroom began to empty, I gathered my things and walked out, my team behind me. The reporters gathered outside, eager to get a statement, but I knew what I needed to do. Monroe and Associates had already made its mark. The story of Garrison and Klein's fall would be told in the papers and blogs for days to come, but my focus was on the future. It was time to move forward, to continue building the firm I had always dreamed of. I stood on the steps of the courthouse, looking out at the city. It felt surreal, the end of a chapter, the closing of a door I had been trying to escape for years. But as I looked around, I realized something. I wasn't just walking away from Garrison and Klein. I was walking into my future. The battle had been long, and the war had been hard fought. But in the end, I had won. And that was all that mattered. What do you think? Was James's revenge justified, or did he go too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's discuss how far you'd go to take control of your own destiny. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping stories like this one. See you soon in the next one.